Sometimes the loneliest people are those surrounded by the most fear. Imagine having all the power in the world, yet no one who dares to simply ask how you are. Emperor Severan ruled Rome with absolute authority, but every meal was eaten alone. Every conversation was filled with terror. Every face that looked upon him showed only fear, never warmth or genuine concern. For 15 years, he lived behind walls of marble and dread, believing himself unworthy of simple human kindness. Then a 6-year-old orphan girl wandered into his palace, looked up at him, and saw not an emperor, but a sad, lonely man. What happens when the most feared ruler in history finally meets someone who isn't afraid of him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Palatine Hill, where Emperor Marcus Aurelius Severan had ruled the Roman Empire for 15 years with an iron fist that knew no mercy. The golden signet ring on his finger bore the imperial seal, a symbol that could command legions, topple kingdoms, and decide the fate of millions with a single gesture. Yet as he sat alone in his private chambers, staring out at the sprawling city below, that ring felt heavier than all the armor he had ever worn in battle. Rome stretched endlessly before him, a testament to power and conquest. The forum bustled with merchants hawking their wares, senators hurrying to morning sessions, and citizens going about their daily lives under the protection of his rule. From his elevated position, he could see the Circus Maximus, where thousands would soon gather for the afternoon races, the temples where priests offered prayers for the empire's continued prosperity, and the aqueducts that brought fresh water to every corner of the great city. All of this belonged to him, answered to him, existed because of his will, but power, Severan had learned, was the loneliest throne in the world. His breakfast sat untouched on the marble table, fresh bread, honey, figs imported from distant provinces, and wine that had aged longer than most of his subjects had lived. The servants who had prepared it moved like ghosts, their eyes never meeting his, their movements quick and efficient to minimize their time in his presence. They feared him, as did everyone else who entered these sacred halls. The emperor rose from his chair, his crimson toga flowing around his tall frame like liquid fire. At 43, he still possessed the bearing of the soldier he had once been. Broad shoulders, calloused hands that had once gripped a sword with deadly precision, and eyes that had seen more battles than most men saw sunrises. His dark hair, now touched with silver at the temples, was kept short in the military fashion that had never left him. The face that stared back from polished bronze mirrors was handsome enough, but it had grown hard over the years, carved into permanent lines of authority and suspicion. He walked to the window and placed his hands on the cool stone ledge. Below, he could see a group of children playing in one of the courtyards, their laughter echoing faintly up to his chambers. They were the sons and daughters of palace servants, allowed to play in designated areas under strict supervision. Even from this distance, he could see how they scattered like startled birds whenever a guard approached, already learning to fear authority before they had learned to read. When had he become this man? When had the weight of the crown transformed him from Marcus, the young general who had laughed with his soldiers around campfires, into Severan, the emperor who ate every meal in solitude? The transformation had been gradual, like the changing of seasons. Each betrayal had added another layer of armor around his heart. Each assassination attempt had taught him to trust no one completely. Each decision that meant life or death for thousands had carved away another piece of the man he had once been. The Senate had plotted against him 7 times in his reign. 7 times he had discovered their schemes and dealt with the conspirators swiftly and without mercy. His own Praetorian Guard had once harbored a traitor in their ranks, a man who had shared wine with him and sworn loyalty while sharpening a blade for his back. Trust was a luxury emperors could not afford. His private secretary, Gaius Flavius, entered the chamber with the day's correspondence. The man was in his 50s, had served the palace for over 2 decades, and possessed one of the sharpest minds in the empire. Yet even he approached with the careful steps of a man walking on thin ice, his eyes respectfully lowered as he placed the scrolls on the emperor's desk. "Your Excellency," Flavius said, his voice carrying the perfect tone of deference that had kept him alive and employed through 3 different emperors. The morning reports from the provinces, correspondence from Governor Lucius in Gaul, and a petition from the grain merchants regarding the upcoming harvest distributions. Severan nodded without looking at the man. "Any word from the northern frontier?" "General Maximus reports that the Germanic tribes remain quiet, Excellence. The winter campaigns appear to have had the desired effect." The desired effect, a diplomatic way of saying that Severan's orders to burn 3 villages and crucify their leaders had sent a clear message to anyone else considering rebellion. The emperor felt no satisfaction in the report, only the hollow acknowledgement of another necessary cruelty in service of the greater good. And the matter of the grain shortages in the eastern districts? Governor Claudius suggests increased taxation on the merchant class to fund additional imports from Egypt. The proposal is detailed in his report. More taxation, more burden on people already struggling to survive. More decisions that would make him necessary enemies while keeping the empire fed. Severan picked up the first scroll and began to read, and Flavius took this as his cue to retreat silently from the chamber. The reports painted the familiar picture of an empire in constant tension. Pirates in the Mediterranean required naval intervention. Bandits in the mountain passes threatened trade routes. Provincial governors squabbled over border disputes and resource allocation. Each problem required his attention, his decision, his authority to resolve. Each solution created new problems that would require future attention. By mid-morning, he had issued orders for 3 military interventions, approved 2 new tax assessments, denied 17 petitions for clemency, and authorized the construction of a new aqueduct system in Britannia. Each decision had been made with careful consideration of its impact on the empire's stability and prosperity. Each decision had also driven him further into the isolation that came with absolute authority. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, not looking up from the latest dispatch from the Syrian frontier. "Your Excellency," came the voice of Marcus Drusus, his captain of guards. "The morning audience is prepared. 23 petitioners await your judgment." The morning audience, another ritual of power where citizens could present their cases directly to the emperor. Most would be trivial matters that local magistrates had deemed too sensitive to handle alone. Some would be desperate pleas from people who had exhausted every other avenue of justice. A few might be genuine emergencies, requiring immediate imperial intervention. All would look at him with the same mixture of hope and terror that had become as familiar as breathing. Severan set down the scroll and straightened his toga. The purple stripe along its edge caught the morning light, a reminder of the divine authority that Romans believed flowed through their emperor. The gods had chosen him for this burden, the priests assured him regularly. The empire's prosperity was evidence of their continued favor. If the gods favored him so much, why did every face he saw reflect only fear? He made his way through the corridors of the palace, past frescoes depicting the glorious victories of previous emperors, past statues of gods and heroes carved from the finest marble, past windows that offered glimpses of the city that called him master. Servants and officials pressed themselves against walls as he passed, their heads bowed in respect that felt more like terror. The throne room was a masterpiece of imperial architecture, soaring columns, intricate mosaics depicting Rome's conquests, and a ceiling painted with scenes of divine authority. At its center sat the throne of Augustus, carved from a single piece of black marble and inlaid with gold and precious stones. It was beautiful, imposing, and utterly isolated. Severan took his place on the throne as the day's petitioners were led in. They approached with the shuffling gait of people walking to their own judgment, their eyes downcast, their voices trembling as they presented their cases. A merchant sought compensation for goods stolen by bandits. A widow begged for her son's release from military service. A governor requested additional troops for his province. Each case received his careful attention and fair judgment, but he could see the fear in their eyes as they awaited his decisions. They did not see a man trying to serve justice. They saw an emperor who could destroy their lives with a word. By the time the last petitioner had been dismissed, the sun stood high overhead, and Severan felt the familiar weight of loneliness settling over his shoulders like a cloak. He had dispensed justice, maintained order, and upheld the stability of the greatest empire the world had ever known. And he had done it all without a single genuine human connection, surrounded by people who would never see him as anything more than a force of nature to be appeased and feared. As the throne room emptied and silence returned to the marble halls, Emperor Severan sat alone with his power and wondered if this was all there would ever be, if he was destined to rule from behind walls of fear until the day death finally granted him the peace that life had denied. He could not have known that tomorrow. Those walls would crumble at the touch of small, fearless hands. The next morning dawned with an unseasonable warmth that seemed to promise something different, though Severan could not have said what. He had risen early, as was his custom, and completed his morning prayers to Mars and Jupiter in the private shrine adjoining his chambers. The familiar rituals brought little comfort. The gods, if they listened at all, remained as silent as everyone. Else in his life, he was reviewing dispatches from the African provinces when the sound reached him, something so foreign to the palace halls that it took him a moment to identify it. Laughter, not the nervous, forced laughter of courtiers trying to curry favor, but genuine, joyful laughter echoing from somewhere deep within the palace complex. The sound drew him from his desk like a moth to flame. He had not heard such unguarded happiness within these walls in years, perhaps decades. Following the sound through corridors he rarely traveled, Severan found himself approaching the servants' quarters, a section of the palace he had not visited since his early days as emperor, when he had still believed in knowing every corner of his domain. The laughter grew louder as he approached a small courtyard used by the kitchen staff for preparing meals. Through a partially open door, he could see movement. Someone was there, someone who had not yet learned to fear his presence. What he found when he stepped into the courtyard would forever divide his life into before and after. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, sat cross-legged on the stone floor, surrounded by a collection of kitchen scraps and broken pottery. Her dark hair was tangled and unkempt, her simple brown tunic was patched and worn, and her feet were bare and dusty from wandering. She was playing some elaborate game with the pottery shards, arranging them into patterns while humming a melody he did not recognize. But it was not her appearance that stopped him in his tracks. It was the complete absence of fear in her manner. When she looked up and saw him standing there in his imperial toga, she did not shrink away or prostrate herself as every other person in the empire would have done. Instead, she simply blinked her large brown eyes and tilted her head with curiosity, as if he were a particularly interesting bird that had landed nearby. "Hello," she said in the matter-of-fact way that only children possess. "Are you sad?" The question hit him like a physical blow. In 15 years of absolute rule, no one had ever asked him about his emotional state. No one had ever looked at him and seen past the crown and the purple, and the power to notice that he might be capable of something as human as sadness. He began, then stopped. How did one answer such a question? "Who are you, child? How did you come to be here?" She stood up, brushing dust from her tunic with the unself-conscious movements of someone who had never learned to be ashamed of dirt. "I'm Livia. I came in through the big doors because I was hungry, and the nice man in the kitchen gave me bread. But then I got lost, trying to find my way out." She had simply walked into the most secure palace in the known world because she was hungry. The idea was so audacious, so impossible, that for a moment Severan wondered if he might be dreaming. The Praetorian Guard, the most elite soldiers in the Empire, somehow had not noticed a 6-year-old child wandering through their security. "You walked in through the front gates?" he asked, incredulous. "The guards were sleeping," she said with a shrug that suggested this was perfectly reasonable behavior for guards. "And you still didn't answer my question. You look very sad. Why?" The directness of her observation unsettled him more than any assassination attempt ever had. He was accustomed to people reading his moods carefully, but only so they could adjust their own behavior accordingly. No one had ever simply acknowledged his emotions as if they mattered for their own sake. "I am not sad," he said automatically. The response that had become second nature over the years. Livia studied his face with the intense concentration that children brought to everything that interested them. "My mama used to make that face when she said she wasn't sad too. Right before she would cry when she thought I wasn't looking." The casual mention of her mother in past tense sent a chill through him. "Where is your mother now?" "She got sick and went to sleep forever. Papa said she went to be with the gods, but I think she just got too tired." Her voice carried the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who had been forced to understand death far too early. "Papa tried to take care of me, but then he got sick too. Now I take care of myself. An orphan. A child completely alone in the world, surviving on scraps and kindness, who had somehow found her way into the heart of an empire." The irony was not lost on him. Here was someone who truly had nothing, no family, no protection, no prospects, and yet she radiated more genuine warmth than anyone in his court. "And you are not afraid of me?" he asked, genuinely curious. She considered this seriously. "Should I be? You haven't been mean to me. You just look lonely." Lonely. The word struck deeper than sad had. It was a more accurate diagnosis than any physician had ever offered, more insightful than any philosopher's treatise on power and isolation. This barefoot orphan had looked at the most powerful man in the world and seen the truth that everyone else either ignored or was too terrified to acknowledge. "Do you know who I am?" he asked quietly. "A man in fancy clothes who lives in a big house?" She guessed. "Are you the one who owns all the marble? There's so much of it everywhere." For the first time in longer than he could remember, Severan felt the urge to smile, not the calculated expressions he wore for political purposes, but a real smile born of genuine amusement. This child had reduced his divine imperial status to ownership of decorative stone. "Something like that," he said. "Tell me, Livia, what were you planning to do after you found your way out of this big house?" She shrugged again, the gesture of someone who had learned to take life one moment at a time. "Find food. Find a place to sleep where the big boys won't bother me. Maybe find some work if anyone needs help with anything." The casual acceptance of such a difficult life made something twist in his chest. Here was a child who should have been playing with dolls and learning her letters, instead planning where to sleep rough and how to avoid predators. She had been dealt perhaps the worst hand that life could offer, and yet she faced each day with more courage than most of his generals showed facing barbarian armies. "The big boys bother you?" he asked, and something in his voice must have changed because she looked at him more carefully. "Sometimes they try to take my food, or they say mean things. But I'm fast, and I know lots of places to hide." She said this with pride, as if speed and hiding were accomplishments to be celebrated rather than survival skills that no child should need. Severan found himself kneeling down to her level, bringing his face closer to hers. Up close, he could see that despite her cheerful manner, she was too thin. Her clothes were inadequate for the cooling weather, and there were small cuts and bruises on her arms and legs that spoke of a life lived without protection or comfort. "What if you didn't have to hide anymore?" he asked softly. "What if someone made sure you had food every day and a warm place to sleep, and no one would ever be allowed to bother you again?" Her eyes widened with the wonder of a child hearing about miracles. "Could that really happen?" "It could," he said, and as the words left his mouth he realized he was making a promise that would change everything, not just for her, but for him as well. "Would you like that?" Instead of answering immediately, she stepped closer to him and did something that shocked him more than any battle charge he had ever faced. She reached out with her small hand and gently touched his cheek, the way a daughter might touch a father's face. "You're crying," she said with surprise. "I didn't mean to make you sad again." Severan reached up and touched his own face, startled to find that she was right. Somewhere during their conversation, tears had begun to fall. Tears he had not even realized he was shedding. When was the last time he had cried? He could not remember. "You did not make me sad," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Sometimes people cry when they are happy too." "Are you happy?" she asked. The question hung in the air between them, and Severan realized that for the first time in 15 years of absolute power, he genuinely was. The palace erupted in barely contained chaos the moment word spread that the emperor had taken a street orphan under his protection. Severan could sense the ripples of shock and confusion spreading through the marble corridors like cracks in a foundation. But for once in his reign, he found himself caring very little about the political implications of his actions. He had instructed the head of household staff, a stern woman named Claudia, who had managed the palace domestic affairs for over a decade, to prepare suitable quarters for Livia in the wing adjacent to his own chambers. The woman's face had gone through several distinct phases of emotion: surprise, confusion, barely concealed horror, and finally, the careful neutrality that palace servants perfected when dealing with imperial decisions that made no sense to them. "Suitable quarters, Excellence?" Claudia had repeated, as if perhaps she had misheard. "For the child?" "Yes," Severan had said simply. "She will need clothing appropriate for palace life, regular meals, and someone to begin her education. She is to be treated with the same respect accorded to any member of the imperial household." What he did not say, but what Claudia clearly understood, was that any mistreatment of the child would be considered a direct insult to the emperor himself. The woman's face had gone pale at the implication, and she had hurried away to make the necessary arrangements with the efficiency that had kept her employed through multiple imperial administrations. Now, 3 days later, Severan found himself making daily visits to check on Livia's adjustment to palace life. It was a routine that baffled his staff and disrupted carefully planned schedules. But he discovered that he looked forward to these visits with an anticipation he had not felt about anything in years. He found her this morning in the small garden that had been designated as her play area, sitting beside a fountain and carefully arranging the smooth stones she had collected around its base. She wore a simple but well-made tunic in pale blue that Claudia had commissioned from the palace seamstresses, and her dark hair had been washed and braided with a ribbon that matched her clothing. The transformation was remarkable. She looked like any other child from a respectable Roman family, except for her eyes, though still held the wariness of someone who had learned to expect very little from the world and to appreciate whatever small kindnesses came her way. "Good morning, Livia," he said, settling himself on the marble bench beside the fountain with far less ceremony than anyone expected from an emperor. "Good morning," she replied, looking up from her stones with the bright smile that had become the highlight of his days. "Look what I found." She held up a piece of polished red jasper, no larger than her thumb, but perfectly smooth and gleaming in the morning light. To most people, it would have been nothing more than a pretty rock. To Livia, it was clearly a treasure of significant importance. "It's beautiful," he said, and meant it. When had he stopped noticing such small beauties in the world around him? "Where did you find it?" "In the big garden with all the statues. The man with the tools said I could keep it if I promised not to dig up his flowers." She turned the stone over in her small hands, admiring the way the light played across its surface. "He was nice. He showed me all the different plants and told me their names. The man with the tools would be Marcus Brutus, not the famous assassin, but the head gardener who shared an unfortunate name with history's most notorious betrayer." Severan made a mental note to ensure that Brutus knew his kindness to the child was noticed and appreciated. In the complex web of palace politics, such recognition could mean the difference between advancement and obscurity. "Are you happy here?" he asked, a question that had been weighing on his mind since the decision to bring her into the palace. Livia considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important questions. "The bed is very soft," she said finally. "And there's always food when I'm hungry. And the lady who brings my clothes is teaching me to read." She paused, then added with characteristic honesty, "But sometimes it's very quiet." "I'm not used to quiet." The observation struck him unexpectedly. Of course it would be quiet for her. Palace life was built around rigid schedules, hushed voices, and the constant awareness that loud noises might disturb the emperor. She had come from the streets of Rome, where life was loud and chaotic and unpredictable. The ordered calm of imperial living might feel more like a tomb than a sanctuary to someone accustomed to the vibrant energy of the city. "Would you like to see more of the palace?" he asked impulsively. "There are parts you haven't explored yet." Her face lit up with excitement. "Really?" "The lady said I shouldn't wander around because I might get lost again." "You won't get lost if you're with me," he said, standing and offering her his hand. "Come, let me show you my favorite place." They walked together through corridors that Severan had traversed alone for 15 years, past frescoes and statues that he had stopped truly seeing long ago. But watching Livia experience them for the first time, her wonder at the painted hunting scenes, her fascination with the carved marble figures, her delight at the way their footsteps echoed in the vast spaces, made him see his own home through fresh eyes. He led her to the palace library, a vast chamber lined with scrolls and codices that represented the accumulated knowledge of the civilized world. The room was his sanctuary, the one place where he could lose himself in philosophy and history and forget, for a few hours, the weight of imperial responsibility. "So many scrolls," Livia breathed, staring up at the shelves that stretched far above her head. "Are they all stories?" "Some are stories," he said, pulling down a scroll with illustrated margins. "But many are about history or mathematics or how to build roads and aqueducts. This one tells the story of Troy and the great war that was fought there." He unrolled a section showing painted scenes of warriors in armor, and Livia studied them with intense concentration. "Were you in this war?" she asked. The question made him smile. To a 6-year-old, all adult experiences were essentially timeless. "No, this war happened long before I was born. Before my grandfather's grandfather was born, but Roman children still learn these stories because they teach us about courage and honor and the consequences of our choices. Will I learn to read all of these?" "If you want to," he said. "Learning is one of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves. It means that no matter where you are, you will never be truly alone. You'll always have the wisdom of people who came before us to keep you company." She nodded solemnly, clearly filing this information away as something important. Then, with the quick subject changes that characterized childhood conversations, she asked, "Do you have friends?" The question caught him off guard. Friends? When had he last thought of anyone in those terms? His relationships were built on necessity, political alliance, mutual benefit, or fear. Even his closest advisors were employees rather than companions. "Not really," he admitted. "Being emperor makes friendship complicated." "Why?" "Because people want things from emperors. They might pretend to be friends when they really just want favors, or power, or protection. It becomes difficult to know who genuinely cares about you and who is simply playing a role." Livia absorbed this with the gravity of a child trying to understand adult complexities. "I don't want anything from you," she said finally. Except maybe more of those honey cakes from breakfast. Those were really good." For the second time in as many days, Severan felt tears threaten to fall. Here was honesty so pure and uncomplicated that it cut through 15 years of cynicism like a blade through silk. She wanted nothing from him except honey cakes and perhaps his company. In a world where every interaction was calculated for advantage, her simple presence was revolutionary. "You can have all the honey cakes you want," he said quietly. "Really?" Her eyes widened with delight. "Even for dinner?" Perhaps not for dinner, he said with mock seriousness, but certainly whenever you want them for breakfast. As they explored more of the library together, Severan realized that something fundamental had shifted in his world. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was not alone. The whispers began in earnest during the second week of Livia's residence in the palace. Severan could sense them following him through the corridors like shadows, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when he appeared, sideways glances from senators and courtiers, the careful neutrality of advisors who were clearly burning with questions they dared not ask directly. It was Senator Gaius Aurelius who finally found the courage to broach the subject. Approaching during the morning session when Severan was reviewing reports from the northern frontier. The man was in his 60s, had served in the Senate for over 30 years, and possessed the political instincts that had kept him alive through the reigns of 4 different emperors. "Excellence," he began, with the careful tone of someone testing dangerous waters. "The Senate has noticed certain changes in palace routine. There are questions about the child." Severan looked up from his dispatch, fixing the senator with a steady gaze that had intimidated stronger men. "Questions. Her presence here raises concerns about security, about precedent, about the proper protocols for imperial households." The senator's words came faster as his nervousness increased. "Some worry that showing such favor to a street orphan might encourage others to attempt similar intrusions into the palace." "Others," Severan repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "And what do you think, Senator Aurelius?" The older man straightened his shoulders, drawing on decades of political experience. "I think, Excellence, that emperors are not required to explain their decisions to anyone. But I also think that your advisors have a duty to voice concerns about policies that might affect the stability of the empire." It was a carefully crafted response, respectful enough to avoid immediate punishment, but direct enough to make his point. Severan found himself grudgingly impressed by the man's diplomatic skill, even as irritation flared at the implication that his personal choices required justification. "The child poses no threat to imperial security," he said finally. "She is under my protection, and that should be sufficient explanation for anyone with concerns." "Of course, Excellence. But perhaps it would ease minds if the Senate understood your long-term intentions regarding her status. Will she remain as a ward of the imperial household? Are there plans for formal adoption procedures? Questions of inheritance and succession?" Enough. The single word carried the weight of absolute authority, and Senator Aurelius immediately fell silent. "I will not have a child's future dissected like a military campaign. She will remain under my protection for as long as she chooses to accept it. Anyone who finds this arrangement troubling is welcome to bring their concerns directly to me." The senator's face went pale at the implication. Bringing concerns directly to Emperor Severan was widely understood to be a potentially fatal form of political suicide. "Of course, Excellence. I meant no disrespect." But the conversation lingered in Severan's mind long after the senator had retreated. He had spent years carefully managing the political implications of every decision, weighing each action against its potential consequences for imperial stability. Now, for the first time, he had acted purely from the heart, and the resulting complications were beginning to multiply. He found Livia that afternoon in the small classroom that had been prepared for her education, bent over a wax tablet as she practiced forming letters under the patient guidance of Magistra Helena, a middle-aged woman who had been recruited from one of Rome's most prestigious schools. The sight of the child's concentrated effort, her small tongue poking out slightly as she worked to make her letters properly, sent a surge of protective warmth through his chest. "How are the lessons progressing?" he asked Helena, who immediately rose and bowed respectfully. "Very well, Excellence. She is remarkably quick to learn. Her memory is exceptional, and she shows genuine curiosity about everything we study." The teacher's professional pride was evident in her voice. "This morning we worked on basic arithmetic, and she grasped the concepts of addition and subtraction after only a few examples." Livia looked up from her tablet with the bright smile that never failed to lift his spirits. "I learned to write my name. Want to see?" She held up the tablet, and Severan examined her handiwork with the seriousness of a general reviewing battle plans. The letters were uneven and required careful study to decipher, but they clearly spelled out Livia in careful strokes. "Excellent work," he said, and the child's face glowed with pride. "Perhaps tomorrow Magistra Helena can teach you to write other names as well." "Whose names?" she asked with immediate interest. "Well, you could learn to write the names of the gods, or famous Romans from history, or—" He paused, suddenly feeling oddly vulnerable, "or the names of your friends." "I want to learn to write your name," she said without hesitation. "What is it? Everyone just calls you Excellence, but that's not really a name, is it?" The innocence of the question struck him unexpectedly. She was right. In her presence, he had become simply a person, not a title or a symbol of authority. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. "My name is Marcus," he said quietly. "Marcus Aurelius Severan." She repeated it carefully, sounding out each syllable. "Marcus, that's a nice name. Is it all right if I call you that instead of Excellence?" Helena made a small sound of shock at the suggestion, but Severan held up a hand to forestall any correction. "When we are alone," he said, "you may call me whatever you like." The smile that spread across Livia's face was worth whatever political complications might arise from such informality. She immediately returned to her tablet, carefully scratching out her previous work and beginning to form the letters M-A-R-C-U-S with determined concentration. As he watched her work, Severan became aware of how profoundly his daily routine had changed. His mornings now included visits to check on Livia's progress. His afternoons often found him adjusting his schedule to spend time with her in the gardens or the library. His evenings, once spent in solitary contemplation of state matters, now sometimes included sharing the evening meal with a 6-year-old who chattered happily about her lessons and her discoveries. The changes were subtle but significant. He found himself smiling more often. His sleep, which had been troubled by the weight of imperial responsibility for years, had become deeper and more restful. Even his interactions with palace staff had grown warmer. It was difficult to maintain rigid imperial distance when you had just come from a conversation about the best way to catch butterflies in the garden. But perhaps the most significant change was the growing realization that he was no longer willing to accept loneliness as the inevitable price of power. For 15 years, he had convinced himself that isolation was necessary, that emotional connections were luxuries that emperors could not afford. Livia's presence in his life was proving that belief to be not only wrong, but destructive. When she finished writing his name and held up the tablet for his approval, the letters crooked but recognizable. Severan felt something shift in his chest like a lock finally opening. "Perfect," he said, and meant it. That evening, as he sat in his private chambers reviewing the day's correspondence, he found himself thinking about Senator Aurelius's questions regarding succession and inheritance. The man had raised valid concerns about the unprecedented nature of an emperor taking personal responsibility for a street orphan. But as he considered the political implications, another thought emerged, one that surprised him with its clarity and certainty. He was not just protecting Livia from the world. She was protecting him from the emptiness that had been consuming him one lonely day at a time. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever political storms might arise from his decision to open his heart to this remarkable child, he knew with absolute certainty that he would face them gladly, rather than return to the hollow existence he had accepted. For so long, the emperor who had once believed that caring for others was a weakness was beginning to understand that it might be the greatest strength of all. 3 weeks into Livia's residence at the palace, the first real crisis emerged from an unexpected source. Severan was reviewing morning reports when Captain Drusus requested an urgent audience, his weathered face bearing the grim expression that usually preceded news of barbarian incursions or political conspiracies. Excellence, Drusus began, his military bearing more rigid than usual. We have a situation involving the child. The words sent ice through Severan's veins. What kind of situation? This morning, she was found in the servants' quarters, attempting to give away items from her room. Clothing, jewelry, even food from her breakfast tray. When questioned, she claimed she was sharing with people who needed it more. The captain's tone suggested he viewed this behavior as somewhere between suspicious and treasonous. Severan's initial relief that she was unharmed quickly gave way to a more complex mixture of emotions. He could picture the scene perfectly. Livia, with her generous heart and street-learned awareness of poverty, trying to help those she perceived as less fortunate than herself. To his guards, such behavior would seem inexplicable and potentially dangerous. Were the servants accepting these gifts? He asked. That's what makes the situation more complicated, Excellence. Most were terrified to accept anything from someone under imperial protection. But a few of the younger kitchen staff took items before the situation was brought to my attention. There are now questions about whether they were attempting to exploit the child's generosity or if they were simply caught off guard by the unprecedented situation. Another political complication in a reign that had been blissfully free of such complexities until Livia's arrival. Severan found himself caught between understanding her motives and recognizing the valid concerns his staff faced when a child connected to the Emperor began redistributing imperial resources according to her own moral compass. Where is she now? He asked. In her quarters, with Magistra Helena attempting to explain why such actions might be inappropriate. Drusus paused, then added with the careful tone of someone delivering unwelcome news. The child seemed genuinely confused by the explanation. She asked why having nice things was good if she was the only one who got to have them. The question, reported second-hand, still carried enough of Livia's innocent directness to make Severan's chest tighten. Of course she would think that way. Her entire short life had been shaped by scarcity and the necessity of sharing whatever little she had. The abundance of palace life, where she alone was showered with luxuries while surrounded by people who served her but possessed far less, would naturally strike her as fundamentally unfair. He found her sitting on the edge of her bed, swinging her legs and examining a small wooden horse that one of the palace craftsmen had carved for her. Her face bore the thoughtful expression he had learned to associate with her attempts to understand the complicated world of adult logic. "Hello, Marcus," she said when he entered, and despite everything, the casual use of his name still sent warmth through him. "I understand you've been sharing your belongings with the palace staff," he said. Settling into the chair that had been placed in her room for his visits, she nodded seriously. "The girl who brings my breakfast doesn't have a pretty dress like mine, and the man who tends the fires has holes in his tunic. It seemed mean to have extra things when they didn't have enough." Her reasoning was flawless from a moral standpoint and completely impractical from every other perspective. How did one explain to a 6-year-old that generosity, while admirable, could create complications when filtered through the rigid hierarchies of imperial society? "It was kind of you to think of them," he said carefully. "But giving away your belongings created problems for those people. They were afraid they might get in trouble for accepting gifts connected to the Emperor." Livia's brow furrowed as she processed this information. "So they were scared. I didn't want to scare anyone. I just wanted to share." She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Are you mad at me?" The question went straight to his heart. "No, I'm not mad. But we need to find better ways for you to help people, ways that won't frighten them or create difficulties." "What ways?" she asked with immediate interest. It was a fair question, and one he had been considering since receiving Drusus's report. The child's instinct for generosity was admirable and should be encouraged, not suppressed. But channeling it appropriately would require more thought than simply forbidding her from giving away her possessions. "Well," he said slowly, thinking through the possibilities, "emperors have special ways of helping people. We can change laws to make life better for everyone, or fund public works that benefit entire communities. Perhaps you could help me identify problems that need solving. Her eyes lit up with excitement. Really, I could help with Emperor work. You already are helping, he said, surprised by how true the words felt as he spoke them. You've shown me things about our world that I had forgotten to see. Over the following days, what began as a simple solution to a disciplinary problem evolved into something far more significant. Severan found himself including Livia in certain aspects of his daily routine, seeking her perspective on matters that seemed removed from imperial politics, but touched on basic human needs. When reviewing reports about grain distributions in the city, he asked her what she remembered about finding food on the streets. Her insights, delivered in the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had lived the reality rather than studying it, theoretically provided a ground-level understanding that no amount of bureaucratic reports could match. The bread sellers near the Forum close early because they're afraid of thieves, she told him one afternoon as they walked through the palace gardens. But that means people who work late don't get to buy bread. Maybe they could have guards or sell bread in safer places. It was a simple observation that led to a comprehensive review of food distribution policies throughout the city. Within a week, Severan had authorized increased security for merchants in high-crime areas and established new market locations in neighborhoods that had been underserved. The bureaucrats who implemented these changes had no idea they were following suggestions from a 6-year-old orphan. But Severan found himself caring less about credit and more about results. Livia's perspective was proving invaluable precisely because it was unfiltered by political considerations or bureaucratic assumptions. Her influence extended beyond policy matters. Palace staff began to notice subtle changes in the emperor's demeanor. He was more likely to acknowledge their service with a nod or a word of appreciation, less prone to the cold silences that had previously characterized his interactions with subordinates. He still maintained the dignity and authority of his office, but the rigid emotional distance had softened slightly. The changes did not go unnoticed by the Senate. Senator Marcus Brutus, the younger cousin of the famous gardener, approached him during a routine briefing with carefully worded observations about the emperor's renewed engagement with civic matters and his increased attention to the welfare of common citizens. These policy initiatives show admirable concern for the people's daily needs, the senator said with the diplomatic skill of someone who had spent years learning to deliver potentially sensitive messages. The Senate appreciates this focus on practical governance. What the senator was really saying, Severan understood, was that the political establishment had noticed his recent decisions and found them surprisingly palatable. Whatever reservations they might have about his personal attachment to an orphan child, they could hardly criticize policies that improved life for Roman citizens. That evening, as he shared dinner with Livia in the informal dining room that had become their regular meeting place, he reflected on how profoundly his world had changed. The child who had wandered into his palace looking for food had somehow managed to make him a better emperor, while simultaneously making him feel more human. "Marcus," she said, interrupting his thoughts as she carefully cut her meat into small pieces. "Do you think my parents would be proud of me for helping with emperor work?" The question, asked with the innocent seriousness that characterized all her important inquiries, made his throat tighten. "I think they would be very proud," he said quietly. "And I think they would be grateful that you found your way to people who care about you." She smiled with the contentment of a child who had found her place in the world, and Severan realized that she had given him something far more valuable than policy insights or a reason to smile. She had given him a reason to be worthy of the power he wielded. By the 6th week of Livia's residence in the palace, her presence had created ripples that extended far beyond the marble halls of imperial power. Reports reached Severan from across the city of citizens speaking in hushed, wondering tones about the emperor who had taken in an orphan child. The story, embellished and transformed through countless retellings, had taken on almost mythical qualities among the common people of Rome. Some versions portrayed him as a ruler touched by divine compassion. Others suggested that the child possessed mystical powers that had softened his heart through supernatural means. A few whispered that she was the daughter of a fallen hero, placed in his path by the gods as a test of his worthiness to rule. The truth, that he had simply been moved by the genuine kindness of a lonely child, seemed almost disappointingly mundane compared to the legends that were growing around their relationship. But it was not just among the common citizens that attitudes were shifting. Severan began to notice changes in how the palace staff interacted with him. Subtle alterations in tone and manner that spoke to a fundamental shift in how they perceived their emperor. Magistra Helena, who had initially approached her tutorial duties with Livia as simply another professional assignment, had developed genuine affection for her student. During their lessons, Severan sometimes caught glimpses of the teacher laughing at something Livia had said, or patiently explaining a concept for the third time with no trace of irritation. The rigid formality that typically characterized interactions between palace staff and anything connected to the emperor had given way to something warmer and more natural. Even Captain Drusus, whose military bearing never wavered in official contexts, had been observed showing Livia how to properly hold and care for a small wooden sword that had been crafted for her by the palace smithy. When questioned about this deviation from protocol, the battle-hardened veteran had simply stated that the child should know how to defend herself with the gruff affection of a grandfather teaching necessary life skills. The transformation was perhaps most evident during state dinners and formal receptions. Previously, these events had been exercises in careful choreography, where every gesture and word was calculated for political effect. Now Severan found himself thinking about Livia's observations regarding fairness and kindness as he navigated conversations with foreign diplomats and provincial governors. During a particularly tense negotiation with representatives from Britannia regarding taxation policies, he surprised everyone present by asking detailed questions about how the proposed changes would affect families with children. The Britannian delegation, prepared for discussions of revenue projections and administrative efficiency, found themselves explaining the realities of daily life for common citizens under Roman rule. My advisors tell me that increased taxation will fund improved infrastructure, Severan said to the lead negotiator, a weathered man named Caius Maximilianus, who had governed the northern territories for over a decade. But I want to understand what that means for a family trying to feed their children and maintain their household. The question caught the governor off guard. Previous imperial administrations had focused primarily on the strategic and financial implications of policy changes, treating human impact as a secondary consideration at best. This emperor's sudden interest in the daily struggles of ordinary families represented a significant departure from established practice. Excellence, Maximilianus replied carefully. The increased revenue would indeed fund road improvements and expanded military fortifications. However, for individual families, the immediate effect would be a reduction in discretionary income during an already difficult harvest season. How significant a reduction? Severan pressed. Would families need to choose between adequate food and other necessities? The governor's honest answer that yes, some families would face exactly such choices led to a comprehensive revision of the taxation timeline and the implementation of supplemental grain distributions to offset the economic burden on the most vulnerable citizens. Similar patterns emerged in other policy discussions. Where once Severan had focused primarily on maintaining stability and projecting strength, he now found himself consistently asking how proposed changes would affect the lives of people who had no voice in imperial decision-making. The shift was subtle enough that most observers attributed it to natural evolution in his governing philosophy. But those closest to him recognized the influence of a 6-year-old who asked uncomfortable questions about fairness and kindness. The changes extended to his personal routine as well. Evenings that had once been spent in solitary reflection on matters of state now often included reading stories to Livia in the palace library, or listening to her chatter about her lessons and discoveries. Her questions about the stories they read together frequently led to discussions that challenged his assumptions about leadership and responsibility. Why didn't the king in the story ask his people what they wanted before he made the new law? She asked one evening as they finished reading a tale about a ruler whose well-intentioned policies had unexpected consequences. Perhaps he thought he knew what was best for them, Severan replied, though even as he spoke the words, he recognized their inadequacy. But how could he know if he didn't ask them? She persisted with the relentless logic of childhood. When I want to know something, I ask. When I don't understand something, I ask. Why would a king be different? The question lingered in his mind long after she had been tucked into bed by Claudia, who had gradually transformed from a stern household manager into something approaching a surrogate grandmother. Why indeed should an emperor assume that his perspective, however well informed by reports and advisors, could fully encompass the needs and desires of millions of diverse citizens? The following week, he implemented something unprecedented in recent imperial history: regular audiences specifically designated for common citizens to present concerns and suggestions directly to the emperor. The sessions were carefully structured to prevent chaos, but they represented a radical departure from the traditional distance between ruler and ruled. The first such audience drew a crowd that stretched beyond the palace gates. Citizens who had never imagined speaking directly to their emperor waited for hours for the opportunity to present their perspectives on everything from local infrastructure problems to concerns about military recruitment policies. Severan found these sessions both exhausting and invigorating. The unfiltered input from people whose lives were directly affected by imperial decisions provided insights that no amount of bureaucratic reporting could match. A blacksmith's concerns about metal shortages led to a review of trade policies with eastern provinces. A mother's questions about her son's military service prompted changes to family notification procedures for deployed legions. But perhaps the most significant moment came when an elderly street vendor, clearly overwhelmed by the formal setting, nervously approached the throne and said, "Excellence, I just wanted to say thank you for taking care of the little girl. It gives us hope that powerful people can still have kind hearts." The comment, delivered with simple sincerity, reminded Severan that his relationship with Livia had become more than a personal matter. In the eyes of his subjects, his willingness to care for an orphaned child had become a symbol of the kind of leader he might be: compassionate, protective of the vulnerable, guided by moral principles rather than purely political calculations. That evening, as he and Livia shared their customary dinner in the informal dining room, he found himself studying her animated face as she described her day's lessons and adventures. She had no idea that her presence in his life was transforming not just him personally, but his entire approach to governing an empire. "Marcus," she said, interrupting his reverie with a question that had clearly been building in her mind, "do you think I'll ever be brave enough to help lots of people the way you do?" He reached across the table and gently touched her hand, marveling at how small and delicate it was compared to his own scarred fingers. "You already are helping lots of people," he said quietly. "Every day, in ways you don't even realize." She smiled with the satisfied expression of a child who had received an answer that made sense to her, and returned to her dinner with the contentment of someone who had found her place in the world. But Severan continued to watch her, recognizing with growing clarity that she had not simply found her place in his world. She had fundamentally changed what that world could become. The letter arrived on a grey morning in late autumn, delivered by a travel-worn messenger who had ridden hard from the eastern provinces. Severan was breaking his fast with Livia, listening to her excited chatter about a new arithmetic technique Magistra Helena had taught her. When Captain Drusus entered with the urgent dispatch that would shatter their peaceful world. "Excellence," Drusus said, his face bearing the grim expression that accompanied only the most serious news. "A message from Governor Antonius in Syria. The seal is unbroken, but the messenger indicated it concerns matters of immediate imperial interest." Severan accepted the scroll with the automatic attention he gave all urgent communications. But his focus remained partially on Livia, as she carefully arranged honey on her bread in geometric patterns. She had developed an obsession with making her food look like the mosaics she had seen throughout the palace, and her breakfast had become an elaborate artistic endeavor that never failed to amuse him. The wax seal cracked under his thumb, and he unrolled the papyrus, expecting another routine report about trade disputes or barbarian incursions. Instead, the words that met his eyes made his blood turn to ice. "Excellence," the letter began in Governor Antonius's careful script. "It is my duty to inform you of developments that may affect the security of the imperial household. Our intelligence networks in the Eastern Territories have uncovered evidence of a coordinated conspiracy involving several high-ranking officials within the empire. The plot appears to center on eliminating threats to certain political ambitions, and our sources indicate that the conspiracy has knowledge of recent changes in your personal circumstances." The careful language could not disguise the stark reality of the message. Someone knew about Livia. Someone saw her as either a tool to be used against him or an obstacle to be removed. The conspiracy that had been operating in shadows had turned its attention to the one person who mattered more to him than the empire itself. "Marcus?" Livia's voice seemed to come from a great distance, though she sat directly across from him. "You look scared. Are you all right?" He forced himself to focus on her concerned face, those dark eyes that had first seen past his imperial facade to the lonely man beneath. How did one explain to a child that caring about people made you vulnerable in ways that no amount of armor could protect against? "I'm fine," he said, though his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. "Just some matters of state that require attention." But he was not fine, and as he continued reading the governor's report, the full scope of the threat became clear. The conspiracy was not some hastily assembled group of disgruntled senators or ambitious generals. It was a carefully orchestrated network that had been years in the making, with connections reaching into the highest levels of imperial administration. More disturbing still were the specific intelligence details about their knowledge of palace life. They knew about Livia's daily routines, her lessons with Magistra Helena, her friendship with the gardener Marcus Brutus. They knew about the informal dining arrangements, the evening story sessions in the library, the morning walks through the gardens. Someone had been watching, cataloguing, preparing. The letter's final paragraphs contained the most chilling revelation of all. The conspiracy's leader was not some unknown provincial governor or ambitious general, but someone much closer to home, someone who had access to the most intimate details of palace life and the Emperor's personal relationships. Our sources indicate that the primary architect of this conspiracy is someone within your immediate circle, Governor Antonius wrote. "We have been unable to identify the individual with certainty, but evidence suggests they have been gathering information about your household arrangements for several months. I have dispatched additional security personnel to supplement your existing guard, but I strongly recommend immediate precautions regarding anyone who has regular access to the palace." Severan's hands trembled slightly as he rolled up the scroll. Everyone who had regular access to the palace. That included his most trusted advisors, his personal guards, the household staff who saw to daily needs, the teachers and craftsmen who had become part of Livia's extended family. One of these people, someone he saw every day, someone who smiled and bowed respectfully and perhaps even seemed to care about the child's welfare, was systematically betraying everything he held dear. "I need to see Captain Drusus immediately," he told the messenger, who had been waiting silently for instructions, and summon Gaius Flavius. Tell them both that this matter requires absolute discretion. The messenger departed with military efficiency, leaving Severan alone with Livia and the terrible weight of knowledge that their happiness had been built on sand. The child had returned to her artistic breakfast arrangement, humming softly as she worked, completely unaware that her world had just been turned upside down. How long had they been watching? How many of their private moments had been catalogued for potential use against them? The intimate conversations in the library, the shared meals, the evening walks through gardens that he had thought private, all of it potentially compromised by eyes that saw not love and friendship, but weakness to be exploited. The irony was not lost on him. For 15 years, he had ruled through fear and isolation, trusting no one completely, allowing no personal connections that could be used against him. It had been a lonely existence, but it had been safe. Now, in the space of 2 months, he had opened his heart completely to a child who had wandered into his life by accident. And that openness had created vulnerabilities that his enemies were already moving to exploit. But as he watched Livia carefully place a piece of fig at the center of her honey spiral, creating a pattern that made her smile with satisfaction, he realized something that would have surprised his younger self. The vulnerability was worth it. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever prices would need to be paid to protect what they had built together, he would not trade a single day of knowing her for all the security that isolation could provide. When Captain Drusus arrived with Gaius Flavius, both men took one look at his face and understood that they were dealing with a crisis of the highest magnitude. Severan handed them the governor's letter and watched their expressions shift through the same stages of shock and grim determination that he had experienced. "How reliable is Governor Antonius's intelligence network?" he asked. "Very reliable, Excellence," Flavius replied after finishing the letter. "His sources in the Eastern Territories have never provided false information in the past. If he says there is a conspiracy, we must assume he is correct. And if he says the conspiracy has detailed knowledge of our household arrangements." Captain Drusus's weathered face had gone pale as the implications sank in. "Then we have a traitor among us, Excellence. Someone with intimate access to your daily routines and personal relationships." The three men looked at each other in silence, each understanding what the others were thinking. The circle of people with such access was small and consisted entirely of individuals they had trusted implicitly. Someone who had shared meals at imperial tables, someone who had been entrusted with the safety and education of the child, someone who had witnessed the transformation of a lonely emperor into something approaching a father figure. That person was systematically betraying them. "What are your recommendations?" Severan asked, though he already knew the answer would involve measures that would destroy the very openness and trust that had made their lives worth living. "Immediate isolation protocols," Drusus replied without hesitation. "Restrict access to essential personnel only. Cancel all regular activities that involve potential security risks. Move the child to more secure quarters and limit her interactions to verified individuals." Everything that had made Livia happy would need to be dismantled in the name of keeping her safe. The daily lessons with Magistra Helena, the conversations with palace craftsmen, the freedom to explore gardens and libraries, all of it would need to be sacrificed to the demands of security. But even as he contemplated these necessary measures, Severan found himself thinking about the child's recent questions regarding the story of the isolated king. She had asked why the ruler hadn't simply talked to his people instead of trying to protect them through distance and control. Now he was about to make exactly the same mistake, allowing fear to drive him back into the isolation that had nearly destroyed his humanity. There had to be another way. There had to be a solution that preserved both safety and the connections that had given their lives meaning. But as he looked at the faces of his most trusted advisors, either of whom might be the very traitor they were trying to thwart, he realized that finding that solution would require a kind of courage he had never needed as a soldier or an emperor. He would need the courage to trust wisely while still trusting at all. The next 72 hours transformed the palace into a fortress of suspicion and careful observation. Severan moved through his daily routines with the practiced composure of a man who had survived multiple assassination attempts. But beneath the surface, every interaction carried the weight of potential betrayal. Each familiar face might belong to the traitor, who had been cataloguing their private moments for unknown enemies. The most difficult part was maintaining normalcy around Livia. She had noticed the increased presence of guards, the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms, the subtle tension that now permeated palace life like a poisonous fog. But with the remarkable adaptability of childhood, she had accepted these changes as simply another mysterious aspect of adult behavior that didn't require immediate understanding. "Why are there more soldiers around?" she had asked during their evening meal the second day after receiving the governor's letter. "Just extra precautions," Severan had replied, hating how easily the half-truth came to his lips. Sometimes emperors need to be extra careful about safety. She had accepted this explanation with a thoughtful nod, then returned to her food, with the trusting assumption that the adults in her life would handle whatever complicated matters required handling. Her faith in his ability to keep her safe was both heartwarming and terrifying. She had no idea how close the shadows had crept to their small circle of happiness. Captain Drusus had implemented security measures with military efficiency, but each precaution felt like another brick in a wall that was slowly rebuilding itself around Severan's heart. The informal dining room, where he and Livia shared their meals, was now monitored by guards positioned at strategic points throughout the corridor. Her lessons with Magistra Helena took place under the watchful eyes of additional personnel. Even their evening walks in the garden were accompanied by a discreet but unmistakable security presence. The investigation into the palace staff had begun with careful background reviews of everyone with regular access to the imperial quarters. Gaius Flavius had approached this task with the methodical thoroughness that had kept him alive through multiple administrations. But the process was yielding more questions than answers. "The problem, Excellence," he explained during one of their private briefings, "is that everyone with intimate access to your household has been vetted multiple times over the years. Their loyalty records are exemplary. Their family connections show no suspicious patterns, and their financial situations provide no obvious motives for betrayal," which meant either the conspiracy was more sophisticated than they had imagined, or the betrayal was motivated by something other than the usual inducements of money, power, or coercion. Someone was providing detailed intelligence about imperial routines, not because they had been bought or blackmailed, but because they genuinely believed that destroying Severan's relationship with Livia served some higher purpose. The psychological profile that emerged from this analysis was more disturbing than a simple case of greed or ambition. They were dealing with someone who saw the Emperor's newfound humanity not as a positive development, but as a dangerous weakness that needed to be eliminated for the good of the Empire. On the third day, the trap began to take shape. "We're going to use their knowledge against them," Severan explained to his inner circle during an emergency session in his most secure chamber. Present were Captain Drusus, Gaius Flavius, and Marcus Brutus, the gardener, who had been included because his daily interactions with Livia made him a potential target for recruitment or elimination. "If they've been watching our routine so carefully, they'll expect certain patterns to continue. We're going to give them exactly what they expect, with one crucial difference. We'll be watching them watch us." The plan required a level of performance that tested everyone's nerves. Severan and Livia would maintain their normal schedule of meals, lessons, and garden walks, but every routine would be carefully choreographed to create opportunities for observation. Hidden guards would monitor all the usual suspects, while the visible security presence maintained its protective posture. More challenging still, they would need to create a situation that would force the traitor to act, a scenario compelling enough to draw them out of hiding. but controlled enough to ensure Livia's safety throughout the process. "Tomorrow evening," Severan announced, "I will inform the household that I'm planning to formally adopt Livia as my heir and successor. The announcement will be made during the evening meal, with all senior staff present to witness the declaration." The silence that followed was profound. Such an announcement would send shockwaves through the political establishment and create exactly the kind of crisis that would force any conspiracy into immediate action. If someone was prepared to act against the child, the prospect of her becoming the designated heir to imperial power would certainly provide sufficient motivation. "Excellence," Flavius said carefully. "Such an announcement would have immediate and far-reaching consequences. The Senate, the provincial governors, the military command, all would have strong reactions to naming an orphan child as your successor." "Which is exactly what we're counting on," Severan replied. "If there is a traitor among us, the announcement will force them to choose between maintaining their cover and acting to prevent what they would see as a catastrophic threat to imperial stability." Captain Drusus leaned forward, his strategic mind already working through the tactical implications. "And if they act? Then we'll be ready for them. Guards will be positioned throughout the palace, with orders to observe and intercept any suspicious behavior. The child will be protected by hidden security that the traitor won't expect. And most importantly, we'll finally know who has been betraying us." It was a dangerous gambit that placed Livia at the center of what might become a violent confrontation. But the alternative, living indefinitely under the shadow of unknown betrayal, was ultimately more dangerous still. Better to force the crisis into the open, where it could be controlled and resolved. The remainder of the day was spent in careful preparation. Severan rehearsed his announcement, making sure it would sound convincing, while still being something he could potentially retract once the traitor was identified. Captain Drusus positioned his most trusted guards in concealed locations throughout the palace, creating a web of observation that would catch any suspicious movement. Most difficult of all was the evening conversation with Livia about what would happen the next day. "Tomorrow I'm going to make an important announcement about your future," he told her as they sat in the library after their usual story time. "Some people might react strongly to what I say, and there might be more commotion around the palace than usual." She looked up from the scroll she had been examining, her dark eyes reflecting the serious attention she gave to all important adult communications. "What kind of announcement?" "The kind that tells everyone how important you are to me, and how much I want you to always be part of our family," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But some people might not understand or agree with my decision. Will I still get to have lessons with Magistra Helena?" she asked with the practical concerns of a child. "Yes, of course. Nothing about your daily life will change. I just want you to know that tomorrow might feel different around here. And if anything seems strange or frightening, you should find Captain Drusus or me immediately." She nodded with the solemn understanding of someone who had learned early in life to trust the adults who protected her, even when she didn't fully comprehend the dangers they were guarding against. That night, Severan found sleep elusive despite his exhaustion. He stood at his chamber window, looking out over the city that sprawled beneath the palace, its countless lights representing millions of lives that depended on his decisions and leadership. Tomorrow's gambit would either eliminate the threat that hung over his small family, or it would force him to choose between the Empire and the child who had taught him what it meant to be human. As dawn approached, he realized that if such a choice became necessary, there was no question what he would do. The Empire had survived bad emperors before and would survive them again. But there was only one Livia, only one chance to protect the innocence and love that had saved him from the hollow existence that power without purpose created. The irony was profound. In learning to care about one person completely, he had become capable of caring about all his subjects more deeply than ever before. But if protecting that one person required abandoning his responsibility to the millions who looked to him for leadership and security. He would make that sacrifice without hesitation. The emperor, who had once believed that caring for others was a luxury he could not afford, was about to risk everything for the love of a 6-year-old orphan who had wandered into his life by accident and stayed by choice. Whatever happened in the next 24 hours would determine not just their fate, but the future of an empire that had been built on the principle that personal connections were secondary to the demands of power and duty. As the sun rose over Rome, Severan prepared to discover which was stronger, the bonds of blood and politics that held the empire together, or the simple human connection between a lonely man and a fearless child who had seen something worth saving in his weary heart. The announcement came during the evening meal, delivered with the formal gravity that marked all significant imperial declarations. Severan had arranged for the dinner to take place in the larger state dining hall, rather than the intimate chamber where he and Livia usually shared their meals, and the assembled household staff stood in careful formation around the room's perimeter. Livia sat beside him at the high table, her small figure almost swallowed by the ornate chair that had been brought in for the occasion. She wore her finest tunic, deep blue silk with gold threading that caught the light from the oil lamps, and her hair had been arranged in the formal style reserved for state occasions. Despite the ceremony, she maintained the calm composure that had become her trademark, observing the proceedings with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Members of the imperial household," Severan began, his voice carrying easily through the marble chamber, "I have gathered you here to witness an announcement of the highest importance to the future of our empire." The silence was absolute. Palace staff had learned over the years to give their complete attention when the emperor spoke in such formal terms. But tonight, there was an additional tension in the air that made everyone acutely aware of the historical significance of whatever was about to be said. "For too long, I have ruled without thought of succession, without consideration of the legacy that will survive my reign. This has been a failing on my part. An emperor's duty extends beyond his own lifetime to encompass the welfare of generations yet to come." From his position at the head table, Severan could observe the faces of everyone present. Magistra Helena stood with her usual professional attentiveness, but there was warmth in her expression as she looked at Livia. Captain Drusus maintained his military bearing, though his hand rested casually near his sword hilt in accordance with their security arrangements. Gaius Flavius watched with the careful neutrality of a man who had witnessed many imperial announcements and learned not to reveal his reactions prematurely. It was Claudia, the head of household staff, whose face showed the first flicker of understanding about where the emperor's words were leading. Her eyes widened slightly as she looked from Severan to the child sitting beside him, and her professional composure wavered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "The gods have placed in my path someone who embodies the virtues that our empire most needs: compassion without weakness, wisdom without arrogance, and the courage to see truth regardless of its convenience," Severan continued. "In her presence, I have remembered what it means to rule not from fear, but from love of those we are sworn to protect." The tension in the room was now palpable. Several staff members exchanged quick glances, and Severan could almost feel the collective intake of breath as everyone present began to grasp the implications of his words. "Therefore," he said, his voice carrying the absolute authority of 15 years of imperial command, "I hereby declare my intention to formally adopt Livia as my daughter and heir, with all the rights and responsibilities that such status entails." The reaction was immediate and electric. Shocked gasps echoed through the chamber, followed by a moment of stunned silence as everyone present processed what they had just heard. An emperor adopting an orphan as his successor was unprecedented in Roman history, a decision that would reverberate through every level of society, from the Senate to the provinces. Livia looked up at him with surprise and something approaching wonder. They had discussed the announcement in general terms, but hearing it delivered with formal imperial authority clearly affected her in ways she had not anticipated. Her small hand found his, and she squeezed gently, a gesture of trust and gratitude that sent warmth through his chest. Despite the dangerous game they were playing, but Severan's attention was focused on the reactions around the room, searching for any sign of the betrayal they knew must be lurking among the familiar faces. Most of the staff showed variations of shock, surprise, and what appeared to be genuine pleasure at seeing Livia elevated to such an honored position. Her popularity among the palace servants had grown steadily during her weeks of residence, and many clearly felt genuine affection for the child who had brought laughter back to the imperial halls. It was Marcus Brutus, the gardener, whose reaction caught his attention. The man's face had gone pale, and his hands were clenched at his sides with what appeared to be barely controlled emotion. But was it the shock of hearing unexpected news, or the distress of someone whose carefully laid plans had just been dramatically complicated? Before Severan could analyze the gardener's reaction further, movement at the far end of the chamber drew his attention. Gaius Flavius was shifting position slightly, his eyes scanning the room with the alertness of someone who had noticed something significant. Following his secretary's gaze, Severan saw what had captured his attention. Magistra Helena was no longer standing where she had been positioned at the beginning of the announcement. She had moved closer to the main exit, and her hand was resting inside the fold of her stola in a way that suggested she might be concealing something. The woman who had patiently taught Livia to read and write, who had laughed at her innocent questions and praised her quick mind, who had seemed to genuinely care about the child's welfare and happiness, was she the traitor they had been seeking? The possibility hit him like a physical blow, but there was no time to process the emotional impact. Even as he watched, Helena took another step toward the exit, her movement casual enough to avoid drawing attention from anyone not specifically watching for suspicious behavior. The trap was working. Someone was about to make their move. The next few moments unfolded with the terrible clarity that sometimes accompanies moments of crisis. Severan's eyes met Captain Drusus's across the chamber, and a subtle nod confirmed that the captain had also noticed Helena's movement toward the exit. The hidden guards they had positioned throughout the palace would be watching, ready to intercept any suspicious activity. But the immediate danger was here in this room with a child who had no idea that her life hung in the balance. "My dear friends," Severan continued his speech, maintaining the formal tone, while his attention remained split between the words he needed to say and the developing threat. "I know this announcement comes as a surprise. Such decisions are never made lightly. But I have complete confidence that Livia will grow into a leader worthy of the Roman people's trust and affection." Helena had now reached the large doorway that led to the main corridor. But instead of exiting as he had expected, she turned back toward the assembled group. Her hand emerged from the fold of her stola, and Severan's blood turned to ice as he saw what she had been concealing. Not a weapon, but a small vial of dark liquid that caught the lamplight ominously. Poison, the assassin's tool of choice when subtlety was required and the victim needed to appear to have died of natural causes. But Helena was not moving toward him. Her target was the small figure sitting trustingly beside him, the child who had spent weeks learning to read under this woman's patient guidance, who had shared stories and laughter and the innocent affection of a student for a beloved teacher. "Livia," Helena called across the chamber, her voice carrying the same warm tone she had used during countless lessons. "Would you come here for a moment? I have something special to show you." The request sounded perfectly innocent to everyone else in the room, but Severan could see the terrible purpose behind the familiar smile. Helena was counting on the child's trust, on the bond they had built through weeks of daily interaction. To lure her away from the safety of the head table, Livia started to stand, responding automatically to the voice of someone she had learned to respect and obey. But Severan's hand closed gently but firmly around her wrist. "Stay here," he said quietly. his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument, while his eyes remained fixed on Helena. The teacher's expression flickered with something that might have been disappointment or calculation, and she took a step back into the corridor. If she could not lure the child to her, she would need to find another opportunity, but Severan was not about to allow that to happen. "Captain Drusus," he said, his voice cutting through the confused murmur that had begun among the assembled staff as they sensed the undercurrent of tension without understanding its source. "Yes, Excellence?" The captain's response was immediate and professional, but his hand had moved to rest openly on his sword hilt. "Please escort Magistra Helena to my private study. I believe we have matters to discuss." It was a polite euphemism that fooled no one who understood palace politics. Helena's face went pale as she realized that her movements had been observed and interpreted correctly. The game of hidden betrayal was over, and she had lost. For a moment, she stood frozen in the doorway like a deer that had suddenly found itself surrounded by hunters. Then, with the desperate courage of someone who had nothing left to lose, she made her final gambit. "You don't understand," she called across the chamber, her voice rising with passionate conviction. "She's destroying you. Can't you see what she's done to the Empire? You've gone soft, making decisions based on sentiment rather than strength. The Senate whispers that you're unfit to rule, that your judgment has been compromised by childish emotions." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence, and Severan could see its effect on the assembled staff. Faces that had shown shock and confusion now displayed various degrees of consideration and doubt. Was there truth in Helena's words? Had his relationship with Livia indeed compromised his ability to rule effectively? "Rome needs an emperor, not a doting grandfather," Helena continued, her voice gaining strength as she gave voice to arguments she had clearly been nurturing for weeks. "The child has made you weak when the empire requires strength. She has turned you into something Rome cannot afford, a ruler who governs with his heart instead of his head." But even as she spoke, Severan realized that her words contained their own refutation. Yes, he had changed since Livia's arrival. Yes, his decisions were now influenced by considerations of compassion and human impact that had not been part of his calculations before. But the results spoke for themselves. Policy reforms that had improved life for countless citizens. Administrative changes that had increased efficiency while reducing corruption. Military strategies that emphasized protection over conquest. "You're right," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "She has changed me. She has made me remember that strength without compassion is not leadership, it is tyranny. And if that makes me unfit to rule in your opinion, then perhaps you have been serving the wrong emperor all along." The confrontation had reached its climax, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered in the palace for generations to come. 6 months later, on a morning bright with spring sunshine, Emperor Marcus Aurelius Severan stood in the palace gardens watching his adopted daughter chase butterflies among the flowering olive trees. The formal adoption ceremony had taken place 3 months earlier, conducted with all the pomp and ceremony that Roman law required, but witnessed by crowds that cheered rather than merely observed. The people of Rome had embraced their future empress with an enthusiasm that surprised even the most optimistic political observers. Livia had grown taller in the months since that terrible evening when Magistra Helena's betrayal had been revealed, but she retained the fearless curiosity and generous heart that had first captured his attention. She wore a simple tunic for her morning play, her hair braided with flowers that she had picked herself, and her laughter echoed through the garden like music that had been missing from the palace. For far too long, the investigation into Helena's conspiracy had revealed a network of discontent that reached deeper into the imperial administration than anyone had suspected. She had not been working alone, but had been part of a group of traditionalists who believed that Severan's increasing compassion represented a dangerous weakness that would ultimately destroy the empire. Their plan had been to eliminate Livia and force him back into the isolation and harsh rule that they considered appropriate for an emperor. The irony. Severan had realized, during the long nights of interrogation and political maneuvering that followed, was that their fears were entirely unfounded. The changes in his governing style had indeed made him more popular with the common people, more effective in his administration of justice, and more respected by the provincial governors who no longer had to implement policies that ignored human cost in favor of abstract efficiency. The Senate, after initial uncertainty about the unprecedented succession arrangement, had gradually come to appreciate an emperor who consulted them more frequently and listened to their concerns with genuine attention. Military commanders found that their requests for resources were more likely to be approved when they could demonstrate how those resources would improve conditions for ordinary soldiers as well as advance strategic objectives. "Marcus!" Livia's voice called from across the garden, interrupting his reflections. "Come see what I found." He made his way through the carefully tended paths to where she knelt beside a fountain, examining something in her cupped hands. As he approached, she opened her palms to reveal a small, injured bird, its wing clearly damaged, but its dark eyes bright with life. "Can we help it?" she asked, looking up at him with the absolute faith that he could solve any problem, heal any hurt, make right any wrong. It was a faith that both humbled and inspired him, a responsibility he carried more gladly than any crown or scepter. "I think we can," he said, gently examining the tiny creature. "Marcus Brutus knows about caring for injured animals. Shall we ask him to help?" The gardener had been cleared of all suspicion during the investigation, his initial reaction to the adoption announcement having been mere surprise rather than treasonous intent. He had become one of Livia's most devoted protectors, teaching her about plants and animals with the patience of someone who understood that knowledge. Passed to the young was the most valuable gift an adult could give. As they walked together toward the gardener's quarters, Livia chattering happily about her plans for the bird's recovery, Severan reflected on how completely his understanding of strength and weakness had been transformed. Helena had accused him of becoming weak, of allowing sentiment to cloud his judgment and compromise his effectiveness as a leader. But the evidence of the past months told a different story entirely. A strong ruler, he had learned, was not one who inspired fear, but one who inspired trust. An effective emperor did not distance himself from human connections, but used those connections to better understand the needs of his people. The capacity to care deeply about one person had indeed changed him. It had made him capable of caring more deeply about everyone under his protection. The little bird in Livia's hands would receive the same careful attention that he now brought to policy. Decisions affecting millions of citizens. Both represented lives that mattered, both deserved protection and consideration. Both were part of the web of responsibility that connected every leader to those they served. "Will you teach me how to take care of it?" Livia asked as they reached the gardener's workshop. "We'll learn together," he replied, and meant it in ways that extended far beyond the care of injured animals. Every day brought new lessons in how to balance the demands of imperial authority with the requirements of human decency, how to wield absolute power in service of love rather than fear. The golden signet ring on his finger still bore the imperial seal, still commanded legions and governed provinces and decided the fate of millions. But it no longer felt like a burden that separated him from the rest of humanity. Instead, it had become a tool for protecting and serving the people who looked to him for leadership. All of them. From the senators in their marble halls to the street children who reminded him daily of what Livia might have become without intervention. As they knelt together in the garden workshop, carefully tending to a creature too small to be of any political importance, but precious enough to deserve their complete attention, Severan understood that this was what strength really looked like. Not the isolation of absolute power, but the connection that made power meaningful. Not the fear that kept subjects at a distance, but the love that brought them close enough to trust and be trusted in return. The cruel emperor who had once ruled through terror had learned from an orphan child that the greatest strength of all was the courage to care deeply, to love without reservation, and to find in human connection not weakness, but the source of everything that made power worth having at all. In the end, everyone had indeed refused to talk to the cruel emperor because he no longer existed. In his place stood a man who had learned to rule not from a throne of fear, but from a foundation of love, taught by a 6-year-old girl who had seen something worth saving in his lonely heart.